There is an ancient book that most people carry in their homes, but rarely open on days like this. It sits on shelves and nightstands, sometimes collecting dust, sometimes dog-eared at favorite verses. But there is a chapter in that book, tucked deep in the writings of a prophet named Jeremiah, that reads like a news report written thousands of years before the cameras were rolling. Jeremiah chapter 49. The prophecy of Elam. The words are plain. They do not need decoration. God says through the prophet, "I will break the bow of Elam, the foremost of their might. I will bring the four winds upon Elam from the four corners of heaven. I will scatter them to all those nations, and there will be no nation where the outcasts of Elam will not go. And I will set my throne in Elam, and will destroy from there the king and the officials." Those words were written roughly 2,600 years ago. And on the morning of the 28th of February 2026, something happened that made people who know their scripture stop and go quiet. Elam is not a name most people use today. But the ancient region called Elam, the heartland of that civilization, sits in what is now southwestern Iran. It is the very land where Iran built its most sensitive nuclear facilities. It is the land where the Persian Empire was born. It is the land that modern Iran calls home. When Jeremiah said the bow of Elam would be broken, he was describing the military strength of a proud and powerful nation. The bow was their weapon, their pride, the thing they trusted more than anything else. Iran trusted its missiles. It trusted its nuclear program. It trusted 47 years of defiance against the United States and Israel. That trust carried them from 1979 all the way to the morning of the 28th of February 2026. Then the sky opened. It did not happen without warning. Though most ordinary people were not watching closely enough, the signs had been stacking up for months. In late 2025, the streets of Iran were on fire, not from bombs but from protest. Millions of ordinary Iranians had walked out of their homes and into the streets because the economy had collapsed. The Iranian rial was worth almost nothing. Prices had gone so high that families were choosing between bread and medicine. The government that had promised them dignity and resistance against the West had delivered poverty and fear instead. The protests spread to more than 100 cities. Young people, old men, women with nothing left to lose, they all came out, and the government sent soldiers with live ammunition. On January 8 and the 10th of January 2026, the Iranian government massacred its own people in the streets. The exact number of those killed was disputed, but eyewitness accounts, videos shot on mobile phones and smuggled out through messaging apps, showed bodies on pavement and blood running in gutters. The world watched. Donald Trump, sitting in the White House, said publicly that help was on the way for the Iranian people. Most people thought it was a political statement. It turned out to be a military one. The preparations for what was coming had been building quietly for weeks. By mid-February, the United States had assembled the largest military presence in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Aircraft carriers, warships, bombers, fighter jets, intelligence assets. The build-up was so large that it was almost impossible to hide, and reporters were writing about it, though the full picture did not become clear until it was already happening. On February 24, Trump stood before Congress for his State of the Union speech and accused Iran of secretly rebuilding its nuclear weapons program. He used the word sinister. He said Iran had developed missile technology that could threaten Europe, US bases overseas, and possibly the American homeland itself. The day before the strikes, international nuclear inspectors at the IAEA reported that they had discovered highly enriched uranium hidden in an underground Iranian facility that had survived the bombing campaign from the 12-day war in June 2025. The inspectors said they could no longer say with confidence that Iran's nuclear program was purely peaceful. Before we continue this video, don't forget to tell us which country you are watching from. That was the final signal. On the night of February 28, the bombs fell on Tehran. The strikes were coordinated between the United States and Israel under two operation names. Israel called its campaign Operation Roaring Lion. The Americans called theirs Operation Epic Fury. The targets were not random. Military planners had spent months identifying exactly what needed to be hit. Nuclear facilities, ballistic missile storage and production sites, radar installations, air defense systems, command and control headquarters, and the leadership itself. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled Iran since 1989, the man who had stood before crowds chanting death to America and death to Israel for decades, was killed in the strikes. Iranian state media confirmed his death the following day. The broadcaster who delivered the news was crying on air. In the southwestern city of Yasuj, crowds gathered and someone filmed them chanting in the streets. In Tehran, mourners packed the squares. The country was split between grief and something that looked, in some corners, like quiet relief. Khamenei's death was not just the loss of one man. It was the shattering of the central pillar that the Islamic Republic had been built around. Since 1979, since the revolution that swept the Shah from power and brought the clerics in, everything had run through the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader was above the President, above Parliament, above the courts. He was the final word on war and peace, on who could run for office, on what the nation would and would not accept. Now there was no Supreme Leader. Iran announced a temporary 3-person leadership council and promised that the clerics would gather to choose a new leader according to the constitution. But the constitution had been written for a living, functioning state, not a country being bombed around the clock. The bow had been broken. But the story does not end there. It never ends at the moment of breaking. What happens after the breaking is where the real weight of the prophecy sits. Jeremiah did not only speak about destruction, he spoke about scattering. He spoke about the outcasts of Elam going to nations in every direction. And he spoke about something else, something that most people skip when they read the passage, something that sits quietly at the end like a door left open in a burning building. He spoke about the captivity of Elam being restored in the latter days. That part of the story had not yet begun. The morning of the 1st of March 2026 did not feel like any ordinary morning to the people living near military bases in the Gulf states. In Qatar, in Kuwait, in the United Arab Emirates, the sky carried a different kind of tension. People who had lived through the 2025 12-day war between Israel and Iran thought they knew what escalation felt like. They thought they understood the rhythm of threat and counter-threat, the back and forth of missiles intercepted and missiles that land, the speeches and the press conferences, and the satellite imagery shared on social media. They thought this was more of the same, just louder. It was not more of the same. Iran fired back. Iran had been preparing for this moment, not in the last few weeks, but for years. Every time Israel struck, every time American sanctions tightened, every time a nuclear scientist was killed in a car bomb or a drone strike, the Revolutionary Guards quietly adjusted, rebuilt, hid things deeper underground, dispersed assets, moved people. The June 2025 war had damaged their capabilities badly. American bunker-buster bombs had torn through the Natanz and Fordo nuclear facilities. Key commanders had been killed. Missile stockpiles had been hit. But Iran was not empty. It had kept things back, held things in reserve, spread equipment and warheads across locations that the satellites could not fully map. When the order came to retaliate, Iran launched what the Revolutionary Guard called the heaviest offensive operations in the history of the Islamic Republic. Waves of ballistic missiles and drones went west toward Israel. More went south and east toward the Gulf states, hosting American military bases. Qatar was hit. Kuwait was hit. The United Arab Emirates took strikes that set the port of Jebel Ali on fire and sent smoke rising over Dubai. The Fairmont, the Palm, one of the most famous luxury hotels in Dubai, was damaged. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest airports on the planet, took hits that sent passengers scrambling and grounded flights across the region. For the Gulf states, this was a rupture. These were countries that had carefully managed their relationship with Iran for decades, sometimes publicly, sometimes through back channels. trying never to become the target while also building closer ties with the United States and, quietly, with Israel. The Abraham Accords of 2020 had opened up relationships between Gulf Arab states and Israel that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Now, Iran was making them pay for those relationships with fire and steel. 6 American soldiers were killed in the attack on Kuwait. Trump appeared publicly and said there would likely be more American deaths before this was over. He was not wrong. He also said that US forces had sunk 9 Iranian naval vessels and largely destroyed Iran's naval headquarters. Whatever the exact number, the message from Washington was clear. Chatham House experts noted that collapsing a regime is far easier than building what comes after it. Iran was being scattered. Its proxies were already weakened. Hezbollah in Lebanon had been gutted by Israeli strikes in 2024. Hamas in Gaza had been devastated. The Houthis in Yemen were degraded. Assad in Syria had been overthrown. The entire web of influence that Iran had spent decades weaving across the region had been torn apart piece by piece since the 7th of October 2023. Now, the center itself was under attack. Jeremiah had said the outcasts of Elam would go to every nation. It was a prophecy of dispersal, of a people scattered so completely that no single nation on earth would be without them. Iran already had millions of its people living abroad, a diaspora born partly of the 1979 revolution, partly of the repression that followed, partly of economic desperation in recent years. In Los Angeles, in London, in Toronto, in Dubai, in Stockholm, Iranian communities were watching the news with a kind of pain that outsiders could not fully understand. They had loved ones still inside. Parents, siblings, cousins, friends. The bombs were falling on cities those people knew by name, on streets they had walked as children, on squares where they had stood in protest. The scattering that Jeremiah described was not just physical geography. It was the fracturing of a nation, the undoing of an identity that had been built around resistance and defiance. When that identity is stripped away by overwhelming force, what is left is not a vacuum. It is a question, a very old, very human question. What comes next? That question was hanging in the air, over Tehran, over Washington, over Jerusalem, over every capital that was watching this unfold and wondering how it would end. The prophecy had one more thing to say. There is a verse at the very end of the Elam prophecy in Jeremiah 49 that almost nobody talks about. The doom, the destruction, the scattering, the broken bow, those parts get discussed. Preachers quote them. People who follow prophecy post about them on social media. But the last verse, verse 39, sits quietly at the end and says something completely different from everything that came before it. It says, "But it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring back the captivity of Elam, says the Lord. Restoration, after everything." After the breaking and the scattering and the judgment from 4 directions, God says He will bring them back. The captives will return. The people who were dispersed across every nation will come home. Something new will grow from the ruins of the old. That verse was not on many people's minds on the morning of the 2nd of March 2026 because the ruins were still smoking. But it was there, written in ink that has survived every empire that has ever tried to erase it. The immediate picture was still one of chaos and fire. Iran was firing missiles at Israel with everything it had left, and the IRGC had officially declared these the heaviest offensive operations in the armed forces' history. Israel's air defenses, the Iron Dome and its more advanced layered systems, were working but not perfectly. Some missiles were getting through. Buildings in Israeli cities were being damaged. Casualties were accumulating. The Israeli public had lived with the anxiety of Iranian missiles for years, ever since Hezbollah's arsenal in Lebanon had become a constant shadow overhead. But this was different. This was Iran itself, direct, unmediated, throwing everything at once. Trump was watching the casualty numbers from Iran's retaliatory strikes on Gulf states and US bases and saying publicly that more American deaths were coming. He had already said the war would likely last 4 weeks. He compared it to a process, a calculated dismantling that had a timeline and a structure. Whether that timeline held was another question entirely. Wars have a way of not keeping to the schedules made for them. The Strait of Hormuz closure was the economic weapon that frightened the most people. Iran could lose this war militarily and still win a kind of ugly partial victory by choking the oil supply long enough to crater the global economy. Even the threat of it was moving markets. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, sitting directly in the path of Iranian retaliation, were now in an impossible position. They had quietly supported the conditions that led to these strikes. They hosted US military bases. They had normalized ties with Israel. Now Iranian missiles were landing on their territory, and their own people were asking questions about how safe this alignment had made them. China's position was deeply uncomfortable. More than 1 million barrels of oil per day that China consumed came through the Strait of Hormuz. A prolonged closure would hurt China's economy in ways that no American sanctions package could achieve. Beijing was calling for restraint and condemning the strikes publicly, but privately, the calculus was complex. China had invested heavily in Iranian oil and infrastructure. It had signed a 25-year cooperation agreement with Tehran in 2021. But China was also not willing to go to war with the United States over Iran. Not now. Not with Taiwan, still the central pressure point in Chinese strategic thinking. So China was loud in its words and quiet in its actions, which effectively meant Iran had no superpower coming to save it. Russia was in the same position. The condemnation from Moscow was formal and expected, but Russia was exhausted by Ukraine, its military depleted, its economy strained by years of sanctions, its diplomatic bandwidth stretched thin. The idea that Russia would insert itself militarily into the Iran conflict was not realistic. Iran had been counting, perhaps unconsciously, on the idea that its relationships with China and Russia gave it a kind of deterrence. That calculation had turned out to be wrong. This is where the prophetic picture and the political picture meet in a strange and uncomfortable way. The ancient prophecy did not describe a nation saved by its allies. It described a nation that faced judgment alone, stripped of its defenses, its military power broken, its people scattered. Then, after that complete dismantling, a restoration that came not from human power but from something older and deeper. The question that people watching the war from a biblical perspective were asking was not just whether Iran would fall, it was what kind of Iran would emerge from the other side. Because Jeremiah had said there would be another side, the captives would come back. Something would be restored in Elam in the latter days. The Iranian diaspora, millions of people scattered across dozens of nations exactly as the prophecy described, was watching closely. Many of them had left Iran precisely because of the theocracy, because of the repression, because of the executions and the closed society and the strangled economy. They had built lives in other countries, raised children who spoke other languages, made careers and homes abroad, but they had never fully left. Iran lived in them the way a language lives in a person even after they stop speaking it daily. It returns in dreams. It surfaces in the smell of saffron or the sound of certain music. Some members of the diaspora were in contact with people still inside Iran, passing information, sending money through informal channels, praying for family members in cities that were now target coordinates on military maps. The grief of the Iranian diaspora was not simple. They did not mourn the regime. Many had fled it. But they mourned Iran, the country beneath the regime, the people who had nothing to do with nuclear weapons or proxy militias, the students and shopkeepers and farmers and parents who were living ordinary lives inside a country that had become a battlefield. The question of what came after the regime was one that serious people were beginning to work on in think tanks and government offices and among diaspora communities. Who would govern Iran if the Islamic Republic collapsed? What institutions would remain? The judiciary was already weakened. The parliament was operating under crisis conditions. The military, the IRGC specifically, was both the enforcement arm of the regime and a deeply embedded economic empire with interests in everything from construction to telecommunications. The IRGC did not simply disappear because a supreme leader was dead. It would need to be reckoned with, Trump had said, in the way that Trump says things, that Iran belonged to the Iranian people. He had addressed the Iranian public in a video before the strikes began, telling them that this was their moment, that they had a chance to create a democracy, to become a partner of the world instead of a threat to it. The words were powerful in their way, but words delivered alongside a bombing campaign carry a complicated weight. The Iraqi people had heard similar words in 2003. The Afghan people had heard them too. The record of that kind of liberation was not encouraging. And yet the protest movement that had filled Iran's streets in January 2026 was evidence that something real was stirring inside the country. Those were not people who had been organized by foreign intelligence services or paid to protest. Those were ordinary Iranians, millions of them, people who had finally reached the point where staying silent cost more than speaking up. That movement had been violently suppressed, but suppression does not extinguish a desire. It compresses it, and compressed desire, when the pressure is suddenly removed, expands very quickly. What the world was watching in early March 2026 was not the end of Iran. Nations do not end. Civilizations do not end with a bombing campaign. Persia had existed for more than 2,500 years. It had been conquered by Alexander the Great and come back. It had been swallowed by the Islamic Empire in the 7th century and come back with its language and culture largely intact. It had been invaded by the Mongols and come back. The people who lived in that land had a capacity for resilience that military planners in Washington and Jerusalem were probably not fully accounting for. Jeremiah understood something about this. He was a prophet who had watched his own nation, Israel, be destroyed and its people carried into captivity in Babylon. He knew what it felt like to watch a civilization be dismantled. He knew that destruction was not the final word. He kept writing even as everything around him burned. He recorded the judgments, yes, but he also recorded the promises. Not because the promises made the destruction hurt less in the moment, but because he believed the arc of history was longer than any single catastrophe. For Elam, the promise was specific. The captivity would be returned. The scattered would come home. A throne would be established in Elam, which most Bible scholars interpret as a sign of divine ordering, something being set right that had long been broken. Whether that is read literally or spiritually, the direction of it is clear. The story does not end in rubble. In the 2nd of March 2026 was still very much a day of rubble. Smoke over Tehran. Ships paralyzed in the Gulf. Children buried in Minab. American soldiers buried on foreign soil. Iranian soldiers buried in their own. The Temporary Leadership Council in Tehran making announcements to a nation in shock. Trump saying the process would take 4 weeks. Iranian officials saying they would never negotiate. Millions of people in a dozen countries holding their breath and checking their phones every few minutes for the next update. But somewhere underneath all of that, underneath the noise and the fire and the fear, an ancient text was doing what it had always done. It was simply telling the truth. Not a comfortable truth, not a truth that makes everything feel better, but the deepest kind of truth, the kind that has a beginning and a middle and an end, the kind that looks at the worst of what human beings and nations do to each other and says, this was written, this was known, this is not the last chapter. The bow of Elam had been broken, but the people of Elam were still breathing, and Jeremiah had promised they would come home.